In our last lecture, we looked at ideological development and performance. In this lecture, we turn our attention to marginalized groups. When Mao Zedong expounded that women hold up half the sky in the 1950s, followed by the abolition of the marriage law, which maintained the supremacy of men over women and prohibited women from divorcing husbands, it seemed that China would be relatively more progressive than the footbound days of its dynastic past. A welcome signal to this aspiration was the fact that Maoist policies sought to achieve gender parity through women's participation in paid full-time employment. Of course, the appointment of Wu Guixian from 1975 to 1977 as China's first female vice premier was a watershed moment for gender equity. Notwithstanding Maoist campaigns against traditional gender norms and patriarchal families, sayings such as men tend the outside, women tend the inside, continue to assign different priorities to men and women, and perpetuated observable gender discrimination. In the post-market reform era of the 1980s, characterized by greater autonomy in hiring, privatization, and retrenchment, Deng Xiaoping admitted some would necessarily get rich before others. From countryside farmers to urban factory workers, he proclaimed, as we've said beforehand, it was glorious to become rich through hard work. The policies of Deng Xiaoping resulted in unprecedented economic development, but these gains have not been shared equally across a highly heterogeneous contemporary China, both in gender and ethnic terms. Observable gender variances continue to exist in China. For example, urban occupational gender segregation increased dramatically after the early 1980s. There was a steep decline in urban women's employment to population ratio from 75% in 1988 to 57% in 2009. Conversely, urban females' labor force participation rates in the market reform era have declined relative to males. Not surprisingly, male and female wages are widening. This is notably occurring in higher status and higher paying occupations. Observable ethnic minority variances also exist in China's contemporary labor market. While most scholarly work conclude ethnic minority earnings are much lower than Han Chinese, who are the majority group earnings, the literature is split on whether ethnic minorities face systemic discrimination or whether ethnic minorities are located in places with particularly poor occupational and educational prospects. Studies have found that minorities were less able to obtain an education, which hurt their job prospects. Other scholars argue that rural minorities are poor primarily due to their geographical circumstances. For instance, while minority incomes have grown more slowly than majority incomes, this gap disappeared when comparing majority and minorities in the same area. The problem is that minorities live in areas experiencing less economic growth. So how do we explain the variances between men and women and minorities and non-minorities? One way to do that is to examine the structural changes. State policies resulting from economic reforms created structural gender and ethnic variances, with the state steadily withdrawing from actively promoting women's rights. This declining state protection perspective can help explain women's and ethnic minorities' lower employment security. When the state centrally organized the economy, the organization of labor was structured to equalize gender and ethnic roles in many respects. With market reforms, the state played less of a role in organizing labor, which opened the door for personal beliefs and discriminatory practices of employers. Intervention would be required at both the structural level and the interactional level, as we will discuss in the next slide, through policies such as affirmative action that change the interpersonal configuration of actors and create more stereotype disconfirming experiences for all actors. Although the state implemented many gender and ethnic progressive policies in the pre-market reform era, the receding presence of the state in promoting gender and ethnic equality under market reforms partially explains gender and ethnic variances in the labor market. China's economic reforms have altered the structures of occupational segregation, resulting in gender and ethnic variances. Interestingly enough, occupational gender and ethnic segregation is actually decreasing in horizontal terms. Females and ethnic minorities increasingly enter traditionally male and Han Chinese dominated high status occupations. Women's opportunities for relatively lucrative non-farming employment have improved with labor marketization in rural China, which has experienced conditions of rapid economic growth and rising labor demand. For ethnic minorities, preferential treatment in education has provided a catalyst to increase the cohort's skills and training for non-farming employment. These mechanisms in sum potentially open more horizontal occupational opportunities for both women and ethnic minorities than was previously available. However, this trend leads to an increase in the labor supply in male and Han Chinese dominated occupations, all else equal because men and Han Chinese are not readily moving into female and non-Han Chinese dominated occupations. The increased competition in male and Han Chinese dominated occupations makes it easier for employers to discriminate in the hiring and promotion process, and helps explain how vertical segregation has worsened for females and ethnic minorities who face increased competition in male and Han Chinese dominated sectors. There is also an interactional effect to factor when examining the variances between ethnic minorities and non-minorities and males and females in contemporary China. Market reforms created conditions where educational disparities can explain these variances between gender and ethnic minorities. Namely, more women and ethnic minorities now have access to education, but this interacts with the changing market structures in China to yield gender and ethnic minority variances. Though reforms have increased the aggregate level of national education, men have benefited more than women. Although women see higher returns to education in some regions of China, this conventional notion may be because many women trade their own income for spousal income, and this is particularly true among less educated women. Apparent returns to education differences disappear if looking at couples' total income as a valid indicator of economic outcomes of an individual's education. Therefore, education under market reforms may be an advantage or disadvantage depending on female marital preferences. Economic reforms have created market conditions where personal beliefs about gender and ethnicity can explain gender and ethnic minority variances. That is, labor is less organized by the state under market reforms. And employers, as we talked about in the last slide, enjoy growing freedom in labor management with the tools needed to exercise discriminatory tendencies rooted in traditional gender and ethnic beliefs. Emerging gender and ethnic minority disparities in involuntary termination can be observed as a result of these processes. The emergence of labor markets, coupled with gender role differentiation within families as prescribed by patriarchal traditions, widens gender gaps in job mobility, and women have become more vulnerable to employer discrimination. In economic terms, the opportunity for employers to practice exclusionary discrimination has increased. If an employer feels on average a male or non-ethnic minority will be more productive than a female or ethnic minority, the employer maximizes hiring utility by hiring the male or non-minority. This trend can be observed in China where men may measure females and ethnic minorities against indicators of luck or good timing, as opposed to measures of effort and merit. Therefore, while market reforms have helped increase aggregate female and ethnic minority employment, they've also opened the door for employers to discriminate in line with their personal beliefs. Market reforms has also created conditions where different networks can explain gender and ethnic minority variances. For instance, as a result of the state being less important in determining workers' conditions, communal institutions like localistic networks and families now underpin the social organization of labor markets. These communal institutions mediate the supply of women's labor in a factory work context, for example, but are also integral in China's contemporary labor market. Access to information networks have significant positive effect on the probability of reemployment for women, not men. Hence, one of the possible reasons for the pervasive gender disparity in the labor force might be attributed to the different levels of access to social networks for many women. Furthermore, differences in the types of networks actively sought out by women and men and ethnic minorities and Han Chinese might explain interaction between gender and ethnic oriented composition of personal networks. Who you know matters in explaining why female and ethnic minority respondents potentially receive lower quality job leads than their male and Han Chinese counterparts. What the studies illustrate is that women and ethnic minorities generally receive job leads of lower quality than do men and Han Chinese. This socioeconomically stratified job seekers who are dependent on the value of their network for quality job leads. Therefore, market reforms have yielded an environment where the differences between male and female networks, between Han and non-Han networks, explain observed gender variances and ethnic variances in the labor market. Finally, we can explain variances in gender and ethnic terms by looking at individual preferences. For example, employers' choices play an active role in the maintenance of gender and ethnic penalties. In several studies, they have found that married women's lower probability of reemployment does not appear to be a result of their choice, and instead may be attributable to employers' reluctance to hire married women due to their social stereotyping that married women are less flexible and less reliable employees. There are examples of systemic and explicit discrimination on the part of employers in China. Advertisements, for instance, specifying that applicants should be male or Han Chinese, or stating that no women need apply, or, for instance, Uyghurs or Tibetans need not apply, are not difficult to find. Existing market and institutional failures have affected the decision-making process of employers. Institutional failure plays a big role in aggravating the gender gap between men and women in the workforce. This can be attributed to the perspective that highlights the diminishing role of the state in promoting gender equality. For example, before the mid-1990s, when employment in urban China was still highly concentrated in the state sector, the employment rate was high for both men and women, highlighting that the hiring processes accorded equal opportunities to both men and women. And a non-random selection employment was not an important factor that affected the wage gaps between men and women before 1995. However, the reduction in the size of the state sector and the increasing private sector in urban areas brought about a bigger fall in the employment rate for women and widened the gender pay gap since the late 1990s. As we've talked about, this is due to a combination of employers' cultural beliefs and autonomy accorded to employers. It allows them to practice decision-making processes that can potentially discriminate against certain cohorts. When we turn our attention to ethnic minority management in China, one of the major questions that is being asked at present day is what explains the rise of ethnic unrest in particularly the bordering areas of China, where we can argue that many of the outsider minorities such as Tibetans and Uyghurs are present. If we use the case of Xinjiang as an example to understand ethnic minority management, there's a few things that we can observe. Foremost, policies that limit ethno-religious practices are a major contributing factor behind Uyghur and Han Chinese tensions in Xinjiang. For instance, public sector employees are forbidden to wear Islamic headscarves and coverings, or fast during Ramadan. Individuals under the age of 18 are not allowed to enter Islamic religious places such as mosques or pray in the schools. The study of the Quran is only permitted in designated government schools, and imams cannot teach the Quran in private. There are documented accounts by Muslim Uyghurs who report that informers regularly attend prayers in their local mosque. Moreover, Chinese authorities have slowly phased out the use of the Uyghur language in the majority of schools and universities, leaving Mandarin Chinese as the main mode of instruction. Interestingly, however, we can argue that the most culpable factors behind current tensions in Xinjiang are socioeconomically rooted, such as segmented labor shares and unequal sectoral distribution in occupational categories. As we've been talking about throughout this lecture, The socioeconomic dimension is a major important variable to examine and to understand, to really look at into the heart of being of the political realities of ethnic minority management. And so, simply put, Han Chinese earn more than Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They are overrepresented in professional and managerial jobs in which over 35% of the Han Chinese working population works, in comparison to 13% of Uyghurs. Part of the reasoning behind this inequitable distribution stems from the fact Uyghurs and Han Chinese rely on varying social networks for job information. There's a tendency for Uyghurs to hold low status and low paying positions, particularly in the service sector, while Han Chinese occupy positions in high wage and high status positions. In effect, these positions become a proxy for available social networks for job information for each group, and ultimately affect labor market behavior to the degree that it reproduces occupational divisions. The consequences of disproportionate access to the labor market is that it creates and reinforces existing spatial divisions, with wages determining residential location. Uyghurs and Han Chinese reside in relatively close ethnic communities and seldom meaningfully interact with each other. This does not bode well for the economic, social, and political integration in the short and long term, and will only intensify perceived or real differences between Han Chinese and Uyghurs, thus reinforcing ethno-religious tensions. The state's response to repeated expressions of Uyghur unrest have consisted of oscillating soft and hard policies. The soft approach is exemplified by the funding and building and upkeep of mosques. There are over 20,000 mosques in Xinjiang, according to the State Council Information Office, which makes this endeavor relatively significant. Further, the state has provided preferential policies in education for Uyghurs, as well as for other ethnic minorities. This consists of bursaries, scholarships, and reduced exam scores for university admission. The hard approach is represented by increasing the visible security presence, as well as re-educating and reforming religious leaders to ensure that they do not advocate fundamentalism or radicalism as defined by the state, or forge connections between the approximately 21 million Muslims in China. The present response to recent unrest in Xinjiang is following mostly a hard approach. There's an increasing security force presence in Xinjiang and random checks of Uyghur activities across the nation. In Xinjiang in particular, the revamped security grid system to manage social control is being employed. This consists of riot-proof HD cameras, policing boxes, and an increasing 24-hour inspection routes. In the short term, ethnic unrest and ethnic tensions will be suppressed, as it has been in the past, with the use of hard policies. Soft policies will eventually be re-employed. In the long term, however, both the soft and hard policies currently being practiced in China do little to address the main reasons for ethno-religious tensions among Uyghurs. Left unintended, this will lead to increasing acts of ethnic tensions in the future. This concludes our lecture on marginalized groups. In our next lecture, we will look at civil society and evolving modes of citizen participation.